Unleash the power of your training. Welcome to Everybody Loves a Podcast. Here are your hosts, Trisha Ben, Evan Hackle, Tracy Jones, and Greg Williams.
It is absolutely fantastic to be here. I am so honored to be shepherding this brilliance through this next half hour of conversation. And we have so much. We're going to be doing a second half hour. So just saying, if you want more, we're probably going to get into some other conversation in the next half hour. But with Greg, Tracy, Evan, what I am so excited about in terms of this conversation is not just pontificating about what podcasting is, but bringing out the brilliance, the strategy, the tactics, everything that makes what each of these individuals are doing so powerful for them and how they deliver their IP and certainly monetize against it. So I'm going to get things started and we're going to have a great conversation and certainly looking forward to questions as well. But just to get us kicked off, I'm going to ask Tracy, do you want to get us started with, why did you decide to start a podcast? And what is the real strategic value for you in starting that podcast, continuing that podcast on? I still have one of my gifts from when I did yours. What tell us about that? What was that journey for you?
Absolutely. Well, the podcast, mine started, of course, when COVID kicked off. I, like so many other people that is used to being all over the world, was all of a sudden right in front of this tremendous portal known as the internet and Zoom and all things related to that. So that's really when it started. My whole thing with resonating with starting a podcast was the timing was right, in that since I wasn't traveling and out, I now had the time to really focus on. And what I really love about it is my podcast is focused on leaders on leadership. So the most important thing that I really had to look at during those quarantine months is I got really clear on what am I most passionate about and what is my point of view, your POV, that you most want to share that message with the market that you already have. And that coming together is why I really focused on all things leadership, because I may not know a lot of things about a lot of things, but after 40 years of working with people as a leader since I was 14 years old, I am so passionate about that. So strategically, it just made sense. The manifestation of leadership, I write, I do courses, I publish, I blog, I do e-blasts. Podcasting was just another strategic way, especially because we could not interact personally, to get wonderful wisdom and still connect people and introduce tremendous books to them.
I love it. Now, Greg, I am getting reports, of course, on C-Suite Radio and our distribution, and your numbers are going up, 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 up. Please tell us what has been the strategy for you, and how is it working in terms of your business model?
Well, I've written 7 books on the topic of negotiations and reading body language. Sometimes I will repurpose content via a podcast. That's number one. So it keeps me fresh through a different distribution channel. Plus that, I also write 2 articles a week. Each article will end up being about 1,000 words. So that gives me fresh content again to also use the podcast with, and it extends my reach literally worldwide. I've attracted business as a result of the podcast by themselves. And you're talking about the numbers going up. The one thing I would suggest to everyone that's actually watching right now or listening is observe what it is that your source of motivation is for creating a podcast. I have a lifestyle endeavor that I wish to live towards, which ties into why I only create my podcast as a solo individual. Now, what that means is all I do is repurpose content, either written content or things of that nature, and I don't interview individuals for my particular session. Thus, I'm the star within my own mind as I'm actually podcasting, and I watch the numbers go up, and we then monetize that on the back end, and I know you're going to talk about that in a moment, Trisha.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And now I'm not going to do this going forward. We're going to bounce around in the conversation, but just to get us started in the opening positions, I want to go one by one. And so, Evan, that leaves me to you. And I'm so honored and thrilled to be here at your event. And You are one of the most strategic-minded people, an incredible business leader. You know how much podcasting has grown year over year, and I love it. I always get emails from Evan saying, have you thought about this? What about that? Here's something that's interesting that the competition is doing, and you're seeing the same things we're seeing, massive increase in terms of listenership. What are your thoughts and why the podcast for you? How are you using it strategically for your business?
Well, first off, I want to say I'm not as intelligent as Greg because I could not do a podcast where I'm the only speaker every time and come up with fresh and good content. So hats off to Greg. My vision actually started, Tricia, because of the C-suite and because of the recommendation to do a podcast. And my original thoughts, which are completely different than my thoughts today, my original thoughts of the podcast were to build a list to email to for marketing purpose. Today, it's really about creating a relationship with people. It's about, for me personally, I'm a lifelong learner. So every time I interview a guest, I'm learning. So I get this great opportunity once a week to meet a new person who's generally pretty wise and pretty sharp, get to learn about their businesses. I get to share it. And then the key, and I think Greg really touched upon this, is the repurposing and the expansion. So every podcast I have gets turned into a blog article. And now I have a book club, and I'm focusing on books of people I podcast with. So I got a book club, and then we also take every one of our podcasts, we put it in our learning management system, so our customers that feel the podcast is of value can download the podcast on our learning management system. And then the other thing, and I think this is really important for some people, is the podcast is an opportunity, not all the time, for me to develop business relationships with people. So, I talk to people on the podcast, and, after the podcast is done, we find sometimes ways to work together and develop, connections. So for me, building customers and things like that. Having said that, I would do the podcast just for what I gain personally from it. I mean, it's like, when you see your calendar and you go, oh my goodness, the day. Oh. I see a podcast and I go, yeah.
It's going to be a great day. The best day ever. Best day ever, right?
I mean, you saw my podcast I did with Kevin and Mark. I mean, that was fun.
Mm-hmm.
That was fun. So
phenomenal. So across the C-Suite Network platform, and I'm going to tie this into what you were talking about, the people you want to be able to do business with. We've seen 450% increase in listeners, 120% increase in new shows, and 132% increase in the number of episodes. Now, how does that play into, and how are each of you using that from a lead gen perspective?
The quality of my guests have increased hugely. I had Carly Farinas, who, ex-CEO of Hewlett Packard, ex-presidential candidate. Her people reached out to me to be on my podcast. And, that's a result of the podcast getting better exposure, better seeing. When I first started, a podcast guest was work. I had to seek out. Now I get 3-4 people a week that want to be on my podcast. So I moved from seeking to weeding. I got to coin that.
There we go.
I'm sorry.
And I was going to say, one of the things that I've observed is the fact that as more people are listening to the C-Suite radio, of course, when the tide rises, all ships rise, or when the tide, what is it? I think that's the cliche.
Tide rises, all ships rise with it.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why my listenership has always been going up, or at least that's what I attribute it to, as opposed to the great content I think I'm creating. But I want to touch on something that Evan said also a moment ago and tie that into something that Tracy said earlier. A lot of times we find ourselves in environments where if we are not within a cluster of like-minded individuals, we can falter and not even really know the reason why such is occurring. And thus, within the C-suite environment, there's this collage of expertise from which anyone and every one of us can tap into and do via the podcast that we actually create. So I just wanted to cite that as not only being beneficial, but at the same time, why it is that I feel as though my listenership is just going higher and higher and higher.
Absolutely. And just to chime in with these two, what they gentlemen said, it's really, as Evan said, it's as iron sharpens iron. And when you bring somebody on your podcast, you are introducing them to your whole world, your whole family. And I know what I do really well, but my listeners may need what my guest does really well. So you're almost offering them as a resource. And Tricia, my favorite C-suite word, reciprocity. And I got to tell you something, it's also a great honor. You know, the other thing is when people say, oh, you're a publisher. Oh, you have a podcast. I mean, it's an opportunity, like you're inviting them to a special event and they're the featured guest of honor. Or Greg, if you're doing it individually, you're just sharing your wisdom. And there's just something really cool about that. And Evan, I love it now that you said there are people that I never could have got close to before this time period. But now everybody's so open to connecting in a much more intimate way. And podcasting really is. You get somebody in your head, in your ears, and that's a whole different thing than sitting 500 feet back from the stage. Although I still love live events, but it's such a great referral networking thing. You get introduced, and then even if somebody doesn't want to publish with me, I guarantee somebody listening on that podcast knows, what do they say? The average person has 250 other leads. That one person has people that know people that know people. So it's just a beautiful thing.
How are you purposeful, Tracy? Just you're leading perfectly into that whole question of what is the monetization? You know, how are you monetizing against that opportunity?
Well, I love that question. It's what Evan said. You don't really do it to grow your business. You do it as a way of living. And as Evan said, leadership is lifelong learning. When you want to give back reciprocity, I think of Bob Bergen, the Go-Giver. The more you give to your guests and your listeners and your interviewees, the more it like blesses them and it comes back to you. People want to partner with you. They want to refer you. They want to have you on their show. They want to have you speak at their chamber events. All kind of different things that I never really tactically said, this is how I'm going to monetize it. Maybe someday I'll get that crafty. But now it's just really, you put good stuff out there and people resonate with that. They gravitate to you. And together, the best monetization is a robust network of resources and advocates.
You know, on the subject of Bob Burr, I got introduced to Bob and someone said, you know, I should be on podcast. And so I connect with Bob via email and said, Bob, should we have a conversation, see if I fit, be a good guest? And he says, why would I do that? Let's just do the podcast. And if I don't like your podcast, I just won't use it. But why waste time? I'll get to know you when we do the podcast. So I did his podcast. It was a great podcast. And then I invited him to be on my podcast, Reciprocity. And then he was on my podcast. And then I adopted his entire idea. I mean, I read someone's bio. Why do they want to be here? My podcast is on training and how does training, which can be leadership, can be mindset, there can be coaching. There are a lot of little spurs to it. But, you know, when I get somebody who wants to be on my show and they're a biochemist, it's not a good fit. But if somebody's a good fit, I just do the podcast and get to know them that way. And, it's very efficient. If I had to spend a half hour vetting everybody, it would just make it more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm done recording, I don't like it, which is out of 150 episodes, only happened twice. I just don't use it.
And to the point of monetizing the podcast, I actually use some of them to bundle with other products that I have, which is another strategic reason I chose to do my podcast as a solo announcer producer, as it were, because if I can bundle some of the visual products that I have, some of the non-audible products that I have, I can increase the perceived value of those products. That's number one. Speak on the topic of negotiation and reading body language. It's somewhat niched to the craft of those disciplines. And when I try to invite other guests, and I've only done it twice, so I'm not going to make it sound like I tried to invite a whole lot of people on in that field of expertise. I find sometimes that it has gotten challenging to have them come on. And so I said, hey, the heck with this, I'll go it alone. Plus, I can create my podcast in the time frames that I choose, like I said, twice a week. And while doing so, I feel a lot more aligned with the time that I set aside to do so.
Right. That's a powerful concept in terms of the thoughts about what a podcast looks like. So I'm going to segue us into, if somebody here is listening and they're thinking, geez, how would I even begin? You know, what advice would you have for them now that you are where you are? How do I start?
Go with the C-suite. Okay, go ahead. I mean, enough. Go ahead.
No, in all seriousness, there are multiple ways to start, but starting on your own without any knowledge, you know, we talked about mentoring earlier today. I mean, the C-suite's all about mentoring. I mean, it's an amazing, so first off, they make it easy for you to get on every single possible platform. They have their own platform, which is huge. They're able to monetize by adding ads to your actual show. But more importantly is the amazing network of people that you can talk to. And it's an unbelievable source of finding guests. It's an unbelievable source of asking people what's working, not working. You know, what length are you doing? You know, are you on the TV show? How do you repurpose? How do you reuse? I mean, you know, it's crazy and not to use and go, if you're going to start with an organization where they actually know how to start podcasts. Because if you're going to spend the time, you might as well do it right. I mean, I think the average podcast in the country is like 145 listeners, you know, and, you know, I'm not going to do a podcast for 145 listeners. You know, I mean, I like doing them, but, you know, that's ineffective use of my time. So yes, we're all unabashed fans of yours.
Thank you, Evan. You know, I mean, that is what we strive for, is to make it as simple as possible, learning and supporting each other and certainly collaborating with each other, which all three of you are such phenomenal examples of, right? How we help each other. So if we have people here who are saying, okay, just a little too much right now, but I want to get onto podcasts. What is the best way to get onto a podcast, show up, and really be a great contributor when it comes to being a guest on a podcast?
Well, I was going to say, first of all, you have to have something of value and know exactly who it is whose podcast would be perceived or would perceive you as having the most valuable value to be on their podcast. Evan alluded to the bioscientist or whatever it was a moment ago. And hey, if that's your skill set, all well and good, but it's not the right or best skill set for some podcasts. So you need to know who it is that has a podcast that's looking for your type of skills. And again, I go right back to what I said a moment ago, which was somewhat tongue-in-cheek about go right to the C-suite. If you need someone to help lead you through the jungle, find someone that's already cut a path. And the C-suite has done just that.
Well, yeah, I get a lot of guests from my fellow C-suite members, and I love that, and it's fantastic. But if we're not being, you know, unabashedly a C-suite person, you can definitely go online. Most podcasts have their own websites. You know, my podcast has a guest website. By the way, if you're in training and you work for a company and actually do training, which to me is my ideal guest, please go to trainingunleashed.net, fill out the form. I'm very interested in having you as a guest. But you can do that. There are agencies you can hire, PR firms. If you know, there are a lot of PR firms that they specialize in doing in getting you places as a guest. You know, but quite honestly, it's a lot less expensive to be part of the C-suite. So
And more cost efficient too than a PR firm.
Tracy, anything to add?
No, I would just say the two things that they said. Number one, find out what are you an expert at. People, you don't want to waste people's time, and there is something everybody in the world is an expert at, even if it's just your experiences. And number two, as the gentleman alluded to, ask people. I didn't know how to do this either, and I just said, "Hey, I like your podcast. How do you do it?" And you're going to get a lot of different ways, and then you don't have to set up. You don't have to be Joe Rogan out of the blocks. Okay, you can just start smaller. Record yourself on your camera. Get on Fiverr and get a little bumper and outro. Put stuff out there and start seeing if people are picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also would add, listen to podcasts and find your voice of how you're going to speak on a podcast, because 20-minute answers to a question do not work on a podcast. And
Right.
so there's, like every different modality of speaking, you need to be good at it.
Now, I know each of you does this, and so I would be remiss if I didn't call attention to this. Each of you is so phenomenal as a guest and as a partner. And so that outreach of how do I help you? How do I serve you? And in what we're doing. And Greg and I exchanged that email today. Each of us have exchanged those emails through the different things we've done together. I think that makes such a difference, is really to be thinking to how are you serving in delivering that right kind of content, that right kind of opportunity, and it may be something else altogether in terms of the wider community. Now, there may be other questions, and if anyone has a question they want to put in the Q&A, you are more than welcome to. We love getting to questions. I can't pick on anyone right now. I guess I could pick on Rich and Steve, but I always call on that card when I'm hosting inside of C-Suite. Yep, Evan.
I just want to add one other thing.
Yeah.
You know, the word reciprocity, which I completely agree in. If you're a guest, you want to promote your episode.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you want to go on iTunes and give it a rating. I mean, obviously, give your own episode a good rating, but be honest, give it a 5-star rating. But no, I mean, you want to post on LinkedIn, you want to post on Facebook. If I have a newsletter and I'm on someone else's podcast, I'm putting it on my newsletter, because that's part of how audiences grow. Is the bigger the guest is. So when I put Kevin Harrington on my podcast, that episode is going to be listened to or watched more than an episode when I put on someone that's less well known. But if you're a guest on someone's podcast, reciprocity says that you need to step up and market that podcast. It's part of the deal. Plus, it helps you.
And put that stuff on your media page too. As you're going to start getting on more and more of these, have a little separate landing page where you just then put all these. It's great for getting out there to speaking to. It's a robust thing for your sizzle reel too. People can see how you interact in an interview as well as on stage. So like Evan said, and definitely it's like going to dinner and not bringing a gift or writing a thank you card. Reciprocity. Put it out there, give them a rating, just like we do for each other's books on Amazon's. Otherwise, it's like you were never on the podcast.
And one thing I'd like to add to what's been said is you could also consider, I'm getting feedback. Is anyone else hearing the feedback?
I'm not hearing any.
Just a little, very little though, Greg.
Okay, good enough. I was going to say there's a service called Headline Notifications, and you can literally take your podcast and turn it into what YouTube will accept as a video, and that becomes yet another point of distribution for your podcast.
Phenomenal. So we do have a question. I know we only have 3 minutes to wrap up, and relevancy has been mentioned many times. So in the C-Suite network, we have principles of relevancy, reach, reciprocity, and respect. And so relevancy, we're making things relevant for each other. We're not just going with our own wishes and desires. And reach, that we're extending reach for each other and getting people to the right people faster. The reciprocity is there's always a give when there's an ask. And I'm going to ask, I know Rich has some links We are very, very happy to have a conversation that's more detailed. If anybody's having to leave in the next 2 minutes, we're very happy to have a more detailed conversation about what podcasting is like and any detailed questions you may have about you and your opportunities to create a podcast, be on podcasts, etc. That's going to be at 3:30 on Friday. And another give is that 3:30 Eastern, I should say. Another give is that we're going to be doing Celebrates on Friday evening, and we have one of our rock stars releasing a new album on Friday. He's going to be singing for us Friday night. So that's Kaylin Chase, and so we're going to have a great Friday night. You're more than welcome to join as our guest. So those are some gives that we have. So in terms of this question, now, Evan, should we allow people a couple of minutes to be moving in and out?
Yeah, we have a minute and 10 seconds, and I'll give my answer.
Perfect.
Biggest challenge is time.
Mm-hmm.
And the key to succeeding with time is organization. So I've got a type form all set up where the person puts their picture, their bio, answers a few key questions, clicks a Calendarly, sets the time and sets the appointment in the schedule. It works incredibly well. You need to think about how to be really efficient doing this, who's going to be editing and make the time, because I think most people fail because they don't have the time, and that's about prioritization. So that would be my answer.
30 seconds, Tracy and Greg.
Absolutely. Just what he said, I go through MailChimp. It's very tightly formatted. The questions you get on the calendar link if you need to reschedule. And then I use Podetize because I have the audio, but then I also like the transcription service because sometimes people like they're visual learners as well as auditory learners.
And I don't have that challenge because I'm solo. So I schedule my time with myself and I know when it's going to happen.
Solving a challenge. There we go. Thank you so much, Greg, Tracy, Evan. What a great conversation.